Good afternoon. Welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Association of the Philippines Forum. And this is a very interesting topic that we're supposed to be discussing today. My name is Jamela Alindogan. I'm the correspondent of Al Jazeera English and also currently the president of FOCAP. Now, the question is, will the Biden presidency change anything in the disputed South China Sea? We've invited two prominent and respected experts to discuss the impact of a Joe Biden presidency on American policy, commitment, and presence in the increasingly worrisome South China Sea today. While US security policy and strategy have generally been laid out in the region and would likely continue, the rise of a much tempered American successor to President Trump, who is known for his volatile personality, has sparked more questions on what lies ahead in one of the world's most hotly disputed waterways.
Okay, join.
Aside from being a widely sought analyst on the South China Sea territorial conflicts, Carl Thayer is currently Emeritus Professor of Politics and Visiting Fellow of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of New South Wales, Canberra. He is also Director of Thayer Consultancy, which provides political analysis of regional security issues and other research to selected clients. He holds an MA in Southeast Asian Studies from Yale and a PhD in International Relations from the Australian National University. He has studied the Vietnamese language, Thai, and the Lao languages among a list of academic pursuits. Now, we also have our very own from Manila, Mr. J. Batong Bakal, another distinguished expert on the territorial conflicts. He's the director of the UP Institute for Maritime Affairs and Law of the Sea. He teaches courses on property, obligations and contracts, and law of the sea and natural resources. He obtained his Bachelor of Laws in 1991 from the UP College of Law and master's degree in marine management and doctorate also in the science of law from Dalhousie University in Canada. His career spans a diverse field of marine policy research. He was a member of the technical team that prepared and defended the Philippine claim to a continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles in the Benham Rise. The claim was made in a submission filed before the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf pursuant to the provisions of the Law of the Sea Convention. The Commission recognized Philippine jurisdiction over the Benham Rise region in April 2012. Good afternoon, Carl and Jay. Thank you for talking to FOCAP.
Hi, good afternoon.
Hi. And to Carl, belated happy birthday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks
So
for
now,
having me.
we have a very interesting topic to discuss today. Before I move to Jay, I would just like to ask Carl, your thoughts on the first 150 days of a Biden presidency.
Right, thank you, Jamila. The first 150 days begins on 20th of January and not tomorrow. So when the president comes in, he's going to have a domestic focus, but I want to look at the national security. Under legislation, his administration must produce for Congress within 150 days a national security strategy to go before Congress. That will be an interagency process, coordination between intelligence, defense, treasury, and state and other bodies. And that's important because once that document is tabled, a national defense strategy will follow and likely an Indo-Pacific strategy will follow. So in a sense, when we're trying to guess what his policies are going to be, this is when they're articulated and expressed. Second, after the disruption that we currently see with the Trump administration and the national security, you'll have, I believe, the restoration of the National Security Council as it existed pre-Trump. The president will attend meetings, as he has. The vice president can attend those meetings. And you have all the principals, the key secretaries, defense, state, treasury, head of national intelligence, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, et cetera, that will be there. And since Biden is the former vice president, he could sit in on the National Security Council. He has that experience. He had access to the president's daily intelligence brief. So he and having in his background served on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and time as chair, he will come in and there will be orderly process and consultation and listening of advice. And even though the buck stops with the president, it won't be so idiosyncratic and variable, because I think Biden will be the consensus maker and give direction for his foreign policy preferences themselves. And then finally, the Indo-Pacific Command has greater resources than any American ambassador. And their interest and their involvement doesn't really change. It's the same national interest of the US. And that is 300 billion roughly in two-way trade, almost 300 billion in US investments in the region that don't go home, 1 trillion in US goods that go through the South China Sea, and more important, as a global maritime power, the need to link the Pacific and Indian Ocean for deployments via the South China Sea. So in those 150 days, the strategy will be there and a clear definition of these national interests that haven't changed because Trump is no longer president. They were there before he took office, and there will remain after. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. Jay, would you like to share something too?
Yes, I think that given Biden's background, we really will see, in effect, more heads being brought to bear on the problems, not only worldwide, but also the South China Sea. His experience as vice president means that he was also the primary liaison, shall we say, between Obama and Congress, and that means he has the experience and know-how in dealing particularly with the Senate, which, as we've seen in the past few years, due to the political polarization, has been rather difficult to work with for some reasons and for certain persons. But I think his background and experience, as well as his own relationship with probably most of these senators, the sitting senators, especially those that have been there for quite a long time, will prove to be to his advantage. And he may be able to mobilize a lot more in terms of bipartisan efforts, no? And the South China Sea, particularly, has always been a bipartisan issue for the U.S. and U.S. foreign policy. So we will see, I think, a lot of consistency, and probably what will change is the overall tone as well as the emphasis, no? Because the last few years under Trump have been rather well, eccentric is a is a euphemism for it, but that kind of extremism, shall we say, brinksmanship and over the top statements will probably be gone, and we can probably expect much more strategic and measured thinking and actions, no? On from this the Biden administration. That could be good news in the sense that it will be much less destabilizing, and it could be more conducive to really coordinated actions and efforts on the part of especially with the smaller Southeast Asian states, no? And that could be done both in public and behind the scenes. So in either case, it would probably be more well, Southeast Asia would probably be more comfortable with that kind of posture, even though they will still have concerns, of course, about the U.S.-China competition becoming a bit too intense. No? Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jay. We'll move on quickly to questions from the press. We have somebody who is also a member of the FOCAP board. Melo Acuna is the first to ask a question. After the first two questions from the foreign press, we'll open the floor. There's no floor. I will open the session to members of the local press. Melo, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. My question is for the two gentlemen. How different would the Biden presidency be from that of President Trump's presidency as far as the South China Sea, Quad, and Asia and the Pacific concerns? No? How different would it be? Or would it be the same? Thank you.
Probably Carl. If you want to
Oh, okay.
I'll follow.
It's going to be a large amount of continuity, but I think, as Jay was pointing out, the tone and the way the president behaves. Joe Biden wants to work with partners. He wants to reinvigorate the State Department and make it a major player in American diplomacy. That's experts. He's already got 2,020 working groups and former national security advisors to him as vice president advising, and some very good Asia hands. Uh, so for the South China Sea, we take freedom of navigation operations. They go back to the late 1970s, and the first ones were conducted against Australia. So they're going to continue, but at the pace and scope, that will be determined through this interagency review and what I believe the Secretary of Defense advises, and that will come from the chairman, the commander of the Indo-Pacific Command. So the freedom of navigation, that's likely to continue, but how? Military exercises will continue because already it's a commitment to the Quad, and Biden backs multilateral efforts. In fact, he wants to, as one priority, to have a summit of democracies, and all the members of the Quad are democracies in Asia Pacific, so they would have a seat at the table. He's likely to show up to attend the East Asia Summit meetings, the ASEAN +1 meetings, where Trump has been absent. And his principles will likely also go out there. Remember, under Obama, he virtually asked every member of his cabinet to make one trip to the Asia Pacific a year. But I think and we've already seen a stress with lowering the American footprint in the Middle East and endless wars and shifting to Asia. So we're also going to see an enhanced diplomatic presence to go with it. And as I indicated before, as the interagency process works its way through, you'll have an integration of various elements of American national power and deployed in a more consistent way to get allies and partners. And Biden will consult more. He will listen to ASEAN leaders. And I think that it will change the whole atmospherics of what's occurring.
Yeah. And if I may add, no, we've also, I think that we can also expect that Biden will fill in some major gaps that were formed under the Trump presidency, particularly in terms of the State Department and the people assigned to the region. What was noticed before was that under Trump, he did not seem to be appointing people with the necessary know-how or experience of Asia and Southeast Asia. Given Biden's, the signals he's been giving just in this past day, for example, of appointing scientists to a COVID task force, I think we will see that kind of attitude as well in foreign policy, where he will be getting people with the experience, with the background, with the know-how of dealing with Asia and in diplomacy within Asia, so that he can be much more effective, no, in pursuing common interests. That also leads to the second point that Carl also mentioned with the Indo-Pacific and the Quad. We can probably expect that the Biden administration will put more emphasis really into now building up this Quad, because that is an emblem of this multinational, multilateral effort, no? The multilateralism that he has already indicated he prefers. We will see, I think, more that effort being given much more importance now. And that will be coordinated as well with how the US itself acts in the region. I mean, the FONOPS that Carl has mentioned is probably the most visible aspect of that, but I'm sure that there will also be a lot of recalibration and changes in how US forces operate and deal with strategic partners, individual partners like Vietnam, Philippines, and how they deal with other countries in the region like Malaysia. We can expect that there will be a renewed push towards security cooperation on this issue.
Jim, if I could make one intervention very quickly. Neither of us touched, and it's an obvious one, that's international law. The United States is not a signatory to the UN Convention on Law of the Sea, and I will predict it will not be ratified during the Biden presidency because of the way the Senate is controlled. But since Ronald Reagan, every chief of Navy in the United States has said it will be bound and will accept it as common international law. So for Filipinos, I believe the Biden administration will not pull back from recognizing that the arbitral tribunal award is legal and is a basis that the United States will support. And therefore, the Biden administration will accept the note verbal that the U.S. submitted to the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf.
If I may ask, gentlemen, will President Obama's U.S. pivot to Asia ever take place under a Biden presidency? Thank you, and good afternoon.
I think that the pivot has actually already taken place, and it continued even more under Trump. No? Because this is really about deployment of and prepositioning of forces all around the region, and we've seen that in that regard there has been continuity. I think, no, on the part of the U.S. military, they have not really pulled back from that.
What I would add also that remember under Obama, he promoted the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but later his Hillary Clinton, when she ran, said she wouldn't support it. And so what's missing for the pivot, when it was criticized in the past as being too military oriented, the TPP was welcomed as giving the US an economic leg in. I don't put much hope that the US will join the comprehensive and progressive TPP, which ultimately emerged, or even the regional comprehensive economic partnership. I believe the Biden administration will reach out and discuss those possibilities and discuss ways of economic integration with the region along the way. And that's because treaties have to be approved by the Senate. And until we get the results from Georgia in particular and see what the balance is, if it's not 50-50 with Vice President having the casting vote, a lot of this could be blocked. And I think Biden is risk adverse. He's not going to ask the question until he knows it's going to be approved.
Okay, all right. Next question will be coming from Jim Gomez of Associated Press.
Thank you, John. This question is both for Jay and Carl. President Trump has painted Joe Biden as being weak on China and by extension, potentially on his decisions on the South China Sea. That may have been a campaign line by President Trump, but I think that basic question needs to be asked. Do you foresee a less aggressive U.S. stance in the disputed South China Sea under President Biden compared to how Trump handled it in terms of body language, policy, actual deployment? And relatedly, do you foresee because of this possible de-escalation or otherwise? Thank you.
If I jump in again, I think part of that Sleepy Joe is weak. It was campaign rhetoric. After all, Biden called Xi Jinping a thug for his suppression of the Uyghurs, which doesn't sound very weak. But I think from my reading of people in that constellation around him and giving advice is we'll see an attempt to both confront China, as the previous administration has, on its intimidation and bullying, back countries in the region, continue the phone ops, but try to establish a common ground with Xi Jinping where the two sides can try to manage it or at least meet more regularly to work, at least sound out Xi Jinping in the early days. That's the moment of opportunity. But to take, Trump really didn't himself intervene much in the South China Sea. He mentioned it 2 or 3 times in the 2016 election. He goes, China put it in artificial islands. Who asked us? But basically, it was left to the Secretary of State, currently Pompeo in particular, and the Secretary of Defense to articulate that particular policy. It's the stress on Biden, what I call Pompeo's anti-China, anti-Communist Party of China crusade, that's dead. The pressure on regional countries to take sides won't be there. There'll be a pulling back. And there'll be a sigh of relief in the region because of it. And even countries like Australia, we have China as our largest trading partner, face the same dilemmas as the Philippines or Vietnam or anybody else. China can do us harm, it is. China can do you harm, but you have to work with it. And so I think the Biden approach, when they consult with Southeast Asian states, would try to come up with a strategy of pushback that addresses the most egregious points where China is doing it, but not neglecting getting on, so that the economic issues will still be there. And I think they'll be worked through, but not immediately, over a long period of time. But there's no transactionalism also part of Biden, is what I'm really trying to say. They're not going to do a, you do this, I do that, and we get out of the South China Sea, which is Vietnam's great fear.
Yeah, I agree. When it comes to the South China Sea, as I mentioned earlier, it's a bipartisan issue. And so the broader, longer term strategy or policy about the South China Sea will remain more or less consistent. No? So Trump and his personal impact, shall we say, on U.S. policy has really been more because he has not been consulting, has not been taking advantage of the resources available to him in terms of political and human resources. No, now with Biden, that should change. We hope that will change, and that will mean that the Senate and the professionals, basically in the State Department, will have a much larger role now again, and which it's actually better that way in directing South China Sea policy for the U.S. So that means that we will have a much more stable and much more careful management really of these issues. And I think that will probably bode well for Southeast Asia, no? Because as Carl indicated, it will be much more open to coordination and cooperation and consultation. No? And that's really what's really needed right now, rather than jingoism and cowboy diplomacy by just one man and pulling the rest of his country with him.
Okay. The next question will be coming from Marlon Ramos of Inquirer.
Sure.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Corollary to what you already mentioned, sir, do you anticipate a change in the foreign policy of the ASEAN member states, particularly the Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam, under the Biden presidency?
I think with respect to Vietnam and Malaysia, we've seen some adjustments in the way they've been relating to China lately, but that's actually more, I think that's really more because it's responding to China's own increased aggressiveness and assertiveness. No, so having the U.S. Under Biden with a more careful or more deliberate approach, I think, would be better for them. And I don't think they're gonna, for example, I don't think they're gonna change radically. I mean, they're not gonna pull back from that. But they will probably be hopeful that there will now be a lot more cooperation, shall we say, from the United States, or at least a lot more coordination than before, because now the door is open for that multilateral approach. As for the Philippines, that's a very good question, given how we've seen our foreign secretaries swing wildly as well in terms of their posture and statements. But I think, to give him credit, Secretary Locsin has been a little bit more consistent and has relied much more on professional advice and invoke a lot more often the institutional positions of our foreign policy. So that, I think, also will benefit from a better and closer coordination with the Biden administration.
And I would begin to answer that by taking a larger picture. On the 8th of August this year, Vietnam, as ASEAN chair, got a consensus statement about maintaining peace and stability in the South China Sea, that in a sense, with pressures from Pompeo in the US to join the anti-China Communist Party coalition, China's reaction with its fleets and that America's destabilizing. It basically said you start out and take ASEAN and its related institutions and deal with them. So I think for Vietnam, Philippines, and Indonesia, we just saw in the case of the two former ones, when Pompeo went through, Indonesia stayed neutral, just like Sri Lanka. They just stayed right out of it. And there was no mention in public in China, although in Vietnam, because the trip was rather short and didn't have the joint statement or press conference. Vietnam's policy has been set, and it won't allow itself to be entrapped by choosing sides with the US. It balances very carefully all its major powers, including China. It wants support for defense of its sovereignty, so that will continue. And I think the Indonesian position, those advising Biden will pick up on it, and Indonesia will not be trampled on. They won't be put in a spot where they're lectured to about predatory economics and everything else like that. And yes, with Jay on Duterte, I would say there's an opportunity. You know, Trump had, by count, 3 invitations to Duterte to visit the United States. And for reasons of, I guess, if I were the president of the Philippines, to face hostile Congress in Washington and demonstrations out on the street, I wouldn't want to undermine my reputation. And there was that so-called alleged Obama snub. Since Trump isn't showing up, there is no neutral ground. But 6 months after, within 6 months of this next year, ASEAN will have a summit. And then at the end of the year, they'll have one. And if President Biden decides to show up, there are opportunities and for formal and informal meetings if Duterte would care to make it. And I think that the Biden approach would be well briefed, know what his sensitivities are in dealing with the US, and don't raise them. And because they're supposed to be treaty allies, and it's a two-way street. And I'll end by saying the Mutual Defense Treaty between the US and the Philippines reads exactly word for word the same with Australia's, and look at the difference between the two. So you've got to do your own modernization, but you have to then build up trust and build up interoperability if you want it as a deterrent, but not to work that alliance. And some of that, the US can only hold out the hand. And then finally, I think the Biden administration will accept the determination of the outgoing Trump administration that the Calayan Island Group is part of the Pacific for purposes of the Mutual Defense Treaty. And that's important.
Marlon, do you have a follow-up?
Just follow up.
Yes.
Do you also predict this shift in the policy of the US in South China Sea to be more visible? I mean, physically in terms of having joint military exercises with the Philippines and other ASEAN member states, and more freedom of navigation patrols in the South China Sea?
Well, what I would say is because of the strategic uncertainty caused by Trump's behavior, Japan and Australia have made their own conclusions. You work with your ally, the United States, but separately, you pick up the slack and you build relationships in Southeast Asia that might assist the US in its policies, but definitely assist your own country by forming a partnership in the region. So I think under Biden, the encouragement, the allies will be more involved, and I think that will find support from the United States. So a more visible, already, for example, under the Australia-US ministerial 2+2 talks, although it's under Trump, there was a confidential committee set up to plan military exercises for next year. Australia wants those to occur, but doesn't want to get involved, particularly in-your-face freedom of navigation operational patrols. So I think we're already going to see where you have the Malabar exercises now, including Australia, after a long absence. You'll see a shift in a regular pattern of military exercises as a counter to China's. Now that creates what I call an action-reaction cycle, and we could blame both parties like Malaysia does. Warships cause those particular problems. But I think as a way of deterring and standing up to China, that's a way of, you put the ball in China's court. We're exercising, we're not directly threatening. What are you going to do about it? And then if China has to put up and shut up, then the allies have made the case we have the right to be on the high seas in the South China Sea.
All right.
Here.
Yeah, I also think that I mean the trend towards multilateral exercises on the part of the U.S. military has been pretty clear, and they did state back in when was that 2015 or 2017, they did come up with a white paper on this that they will move forward and promote these activities. No, so I don't see that changing, and probably what we will see is really literally more of that, no, but much more broadly participated by more countries. That's probably the preference of the U.S. because rather than bearing the full burden of that of the deterrence that can create, no, I think it would rather want to decentralize or devolve this function as well to the different countries who, after all, are the ones directly affected by what's happening in the region.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Marlon. Before I call on the next member of FOCAP to ask a question, I just want to welcome members of the diplomatic community. We have representatives from different embassies and of course, a regular attendee of FOCAP, TV. Roy Trinidad is also here. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining FOCAP. The next question will be coming from the reporter of the Washington Post, Regine Cabato. Hello, Regine.
Yes, hello. Thanks for taking my question. Earlier, there was mention of the President Duterte's sensitivities and how President-elect Biden is likely to be aware of them. There have been commentary from different analysts saying that the Biden presidency is more likely to call out human rights violations under Duterte. Now, knowing the temperament of the Duterte admin and also knowing all that's happened to the visiting forces agreement in the past year, how is that likely to affect the military alliance with the US and activity in the South China Sea? And also precisely, how will the Biden administration approach the policy in South China Sea, knowing Duterte's temperament with regard to any mention of human rights?
Mhm.
Well, I acknowledge that's helps detract a bit from an argument or the point of view that I was given. First thing I would say is that because the Democrats didn't have a commanding increase of seats in the House, human rights will still be raised. But boy, if they got a larger number, that would be an issue. They've passed the Asia Reassurance Initiative Act, and it particularly singles out the Philippines and Vietnam mentioned, but in other words, to punish those countries financially and otherwise for continued violations. Well, one, human rights will be issued, and I think that and it could upset if you have a friend of the president who wants to go to the US and is denied a visa, and he takes that personally. What can you do? But there is a way of raising these human rights issues. I mean, the US and Vietnam do it. You don't have to shout from the rooftop, or as one of our former foreign ministers in Australia used to say, don't use megaphone diplomacy. That will be an issue. But the question, the issue I raised, where it's in Duterte's thing, I can see why he wouldn't go to the United States. In May 2017, a whole slew of Southeast Asian leaders was invited to the White House. Vietnam was first. You had Singapore, you had Malaysia, you had Thailand, the military. Duterte said no. He was invited again, said no. Then there was supposed to be this ASEAN US Special Summit in Las Vegas. Duterte announced even before much had happened, he wouldn't go. But to me, I think the possibility is when you have a multilateral meeting, a summit that has East Asia Summit, that arrangements could be made, informal talks over coffee or whatever, if they can't do the more formal ones, to at least have the two personalities meet. There's no baggage, I believe, that Biden carries that Duterte should be worried about. And I think Biden would be careful not to close his options off. So I keep saying it, the US, I think, will be much more understanding and upfront than the Trump. But the Trump made from the siege against ISIS in the South, etc., there were a real rise in relations that could be built on. So I'll leave it there. But you're right, that's an incident that could flare. But if it's just members of Congress and the State Department doing it in a diplomatic fashion that might not trigger a Duterte counter reaction. I don't know, but I think the real game should be, before that becomes an issue, to get the two leaders to meet so they can discuss and perhaps work out an acceptable way of having the concerns of both sides raised.
I agree that by this time, the U.S. State Department, through the U.S. Embassy and the various diplomats have been working here in the Philippines for the past few years, they will have had already some idea of how to handle Duterte for the next 2 years, no? And that will include knowledge of these sensitivities and how to raise issues. For me, I think they will treat Duterte rather gingerly, no? Meaning that they will know this that he has certain eccentricity, shall we say, and a tendency for impulsive decisions and reactions. No? Now, knowledge of that and experience of that in the past couple of years surely will already filter up to the State Department leadership when that is installed, and they will, I believe, work from there.
Thank you.
Regine, do you have a follow-up question?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Great. Would like to call on Riza. Good afternoon, Riza Robles, also another FOCAP member. Hello, Riza.
Hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is I'm following up Regine Cabado's question. Well, there is a perception, and I saw it on Twitter and I heard it from my American friends, that Biden will be more vocal when it comes to human rights. And Biden may even lean on the Duterte administration to do something about human rights violations. But as Professor Thayer said, no, Duterte might threaten to suspend the VFA. You know, this is the same thing that happened to Jimmy Carter when he leaned on Marcos, and Marcos threatened to abrogate the U.S. basis agreement during that time. No? So how do you think Biden will champion human rights? You mentioned that that he will go. It will be at the State Department level and the congressional level, but you know Duterte knows also how the politics works in the U.S. and he also might just use the visiting forces agreement as a counter threat. What do you think of that, using the VFA?
Well, Rice, I'm going to say you, and I admitted it before, that's the one fly in my ointment here, is that issue. One, when to say that Biden's going to be more vocal on human rights, that goes without saying. The only time Trump uses human rights is when it finally, in the end, when you want to bash China, all of a sudden you take up concern over the Uyghur people. But prior to that, you hear nothing by Trump on extrajudicial killings alleged in the Philippines or in various other countries. All of a sudden, Hong Kong becomes an issue with the pro-democracy movement because you want to bash China. There's no consistency there. Biden will articulate U.S. values. And then the point being that for any diplomat, and I think Biden will be in a much better position, how do you balance those concerns and values with trying to get progress on them? But in the larger game, the Philippines can't prosper if the environment is not stable, if it can't develop its hydrocarbon resources, if its fishermen are being interdicted, if its sovereignty is always thrown into question, if whatever you do towards China, the money doesn't pour through for the build. So I can't answer the question in a sense that we have to see how it's raised. And I think the Biden administration would be more circumspect, but I agree, it will raise it. Members of Congress will raise it, but since it's not an expanded Democratic presence, the volume will be down a little. And then it's how much does Duterte value that the Mutual Defense Treaty with the United States in light of what China is doing. And then where we mentioned the Quad, what neither Jay nor I have mentioned is it also has an economic component to provide high-level infrastructure. And so there are alternate ways of meeting some of the Philippine demands. But the point is, I'll be waffling on and I'll end because I can't make a definitive judgment one way or the other. I think Trump didn't raise it because that wasn't what he was after with dealing with the Philippines. But yet there was improvement in the last year or so in military relations. Once the VFA threat to suspend wasn't suspended, but even prior to that, there was a buildup. So it's possible to have it both. And it's a question never to I guess, put the needle into Duterte because we know how he will react. And the hope would be that this is a new opportunity. It's not Obama, it's not Trump, it's a new president. And does Duterte himself see the opportunity that provides to reset the relationship with the US in a way that preserves his sense of defending Philippine sovereignty? And can a Biden administration accommodate that?
Yes. Jamela, can I ask one
Yeah.
last question?
No, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thayer. The final question I want to ask is this. When I was doing a piece for South China Morning Post on the Phil-Am reaction to Biden and Trump, I came across these two arguments that were hurled against Biden. One is that under Obama and Biden, we lost Scarborough Shoal because Biden and Obama failed to uphold the Aquino administration and the promise that both forces would get out of Scarborough Shoal. China didn't. The second criticism I heard about Biden is that he is a leader who builds consensus first. But that kind of approach means that he will be very slow to act. Okay, are these pluses, are these negatives, or I mean, how do you react to this kind of criticisms against Joe Biden? Both speakers, please. Thank you.
Well, I keep preempting Jay. Do you want to go?
Yeah. With respect to the first point about Obama and Biden losing Scarborough Shoal, I think that's really traceable to this unfortunate attitude among Filipinos of trying to find somebody to blame for events. And second, a lack of understanding really about how international relations and international politics works, and particularly with respect to that incident, how it actually played out. No, um, as far as we can tell, there was an attempt to broker an agreement, and that unfortunately the other side reneged on it. No, I mean that's appears to be what happened, and that can happen regardless whether it's Obama or Trump. No, after all, the action was taken by China of not respecting the agreement and simply staying no, in Scarborough Shoal and not leaving at all. That being said, the Obama administration did at least take action to prevent China from converting Scarborough Shoal into an artificial island in 2016. No? And that even Secretary Lorenzana has already acknowledged that. No? So I think that that's the outcome of rather simplistic view of things. On the other hand, with respect to the second point, that consensus building is slow, I think this is another unfortunate tendency in the part of Filipinos to think that leadership should always be dictatorial in order to be quick. No? I mean, consensus building is also important, especially if you have more than just one stakeholder, more than just one national interest to contend with. No? In the context of the complex relations between Philippines and China and the United States, no, the need to balance all of these interests, as well as the need to prevent escalation into armed conflict, you cannot say that you need somebody who just acts out on a whim, no? Or makes impulsive decisions. These necessarily have to be very, very carefully made, and strategies and long-term plans are important. No, so I don't think that those are valid criticisms really. about anyone's leadership, actually, not just Biden, no? But particularly in how things are working out in the South China Sea between the Philippines, the U.S., and China.
Yeah, I would like to focus in on two aspects of Scarborough Shoal. I think the first was that Kurt Campbell and Madame Fu Ying met and brokered an agreement where both sides would withdraw from Scarborough Shoal. In my attempt to get to the bottom, I spoke to the former head of intelligence for Pacific Command. I ended up getting two stories. Either both sides left, and then the PLA Southern Command learned about this and ordered the ship back, or one never left. So we leave that. But then if we move, I think 2015, 2016, if you woke up in Australia one morning, the headline of our major national newspaper was China was poised to take decisive and provocative action according to American and Australian assessment and intelligence agencies. That was an attempt to move back and develop Scarborough Shoal. What happened under the weak Biden and Obama? At the end of the Balikatan exercises, the United States kept its A-10 Warthog ground attack aircraft in the Philippines, and they flew around on the seas by Scarborough Shoal. The United States dispatched Growler electronic warfare aircraft to the Philippines, which would have fried the communications, if need be, of Chinese warships and others operating in that area. And two American aircraft carrier task groups were dispatched to the area. And I'm still waiting in 2020 for the decisive and provocative action. So Obama was able to respond. And then for the second part on consensus, the first 150 days is that consensus building period in the United States, which does not mean if a crisis is stimulated by China during that period, that Biden and his national security team can't move into action while they're formulating a longer term strategy. And definitely the commander of the Indo-Pacific Command would have definite recommendations as to what to occur. And hopefully, if we get a James Mattis-like Secretary of Defense, you would have a cool head, but a military strategist who would be able to react to it. So I wouldn't say that in a crisis situation posed by China that could upset the status quo, that a Biden administration would be found dead in the water. Biden has been advised, he has experienced advisors, and the fact that in the 150 days they're still working out the grand strategy and the bits and pieces that they want to carry forward, the US could act.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll be reading one question from a member of the local press from Centro. I think this question may be for Mr. Thayer. Carl, he wrote, more than 70 million voters supported Trump. It may not be directly about South China Sea, but have a look at this question. How do you think this will impact in the politics of President Biden, Joe Biden? Will this force him to shift more towards the right?
We know that Biden has tried to take the center ground and said he's going to rule on behalf of the United States. And any of us who turn on American television right now are seeing demonstrations by Trump supporters rejecting the election. And as they're being interviewed, it's an article of faith. They either believe, they all believe there were no fair elections. This is the black swan that could harm the Biden administration if Trump decides to go and set up a TV station and continue his white anting, biting the administration from below like termites and weakening it. It's a constraint as Biden needs to carry out his policies. But we're talking about South China Sea here. This is more in as each court case is resolved, and we assume that all the cases will not upset, that the Electoral College meets in mid-December. The president is inaugurated. At what point do we see some defections from that hardcore Trump group who actually see that the elections are legitimate? Now, we had a case today where some sheriff put out on social media that people should shoot Marxist Democrats, and he was fired by another Republican. So at the moment, it seems less likely. I mean, these 70 million people, and we saw during the Trump administration that those who voted for Hillary Clinton, there was nearly a 3 million plurality, and there was this, from the Trump point of view, a never Trump constant interruption. If that happens, it's going to weaken the promise of the Biden administration. So we have to see how he deals with it, and how cooler heads in America, do they accept rule of law? And as each court case is heard and dispensed with, Supreme Court makes decisions, and they're abided by. If Trump doesn't want to concede and leave, he can continue guerrilla warfare. But do people finally see the writing on the wall that Biden will be the president? And I can't predict, because those wounds never ended on the Democrat side, but they weren't as violent and as aggressive as we're seeing from the Trump supporters. That's at the heat of the moment. So we have to wait the next 70 odd days until Inauguration Day to see if they finally believe. But at the moment, it's an article of faith. The elections were rigged.
Okay.
Thank
you. Thank you, Professor. I have a question for both of you, and it's about the possibility of the VFA abrogation being extended for another 6 months. Do you think a new administration in the US will actually change things? Do you think that there is a possibility that this may not happen at all? Tell us your thoughts. Jay, would you like to go first?
Well, I think there's already an announcement, or at least an indication that it's likely to be again extended. No? And I think that given the current situation, it also wouldn't make sense, I think, to just allow the abrogation to push through. I mean, on this matter, the ball is in the Philippine court entirely, and the U.S. has already indicated that if the Philippines were to push through with this abrogation, they're not about to stop it. No? It will cause the U.S. to consider adjustments to its policies, perhaps, and its deployments. But in a sense, they will live with it if that is what the Philippines chooses. No, it's really the Philippines' call, because it is the one that will be directly disadvantaged by the loss of the VFA and the benefits that it gains from easy access of U.S. forces to Philippine soil. And in the past few years, we have been actually deriving a lot more tangible benefits, especially the military has been getting a lot more benefit from that access. Marawi is the best example, because I doubt whether the armed forces would have been able to get the necessary support and assistance that it needed, in that conflict. And these were items, the assistance that was provided by the U.S. there was really key. Reconnaissance, intelligence, surveillance. These required assets that the Philippine military does not have yet. Okay, so I think that this will the VFA will continue. And I hope that no impulsive decisions will be taken between now and then.
Professor?
I'm hearing a kind of buzzer thing in the background.
Sorry.
I have nothing really to add to what Jay's saying. If it's extended, it would be wildly welcomed by the Biden administration, because it takes the heat off and it buys time. After all American diplomats that have been appointed by the president have got to offer their resignations, and Biden's going to have to replace them. He can keep others in office for a particular period of time. And there's nothing the U.S. could do as in 1992. If the Philippines wants to terminate the leases on the bases, you've got to go. And I know that the U.S. Navy went and I've been taken to Subic and shown walls where they ripped everything off the maps and took the whole lot and just gave the hollow shell back to the Philippines. That was a bit of spite. But in this case, if they end the visiting forces agreement, the U.S. is not in a position to break crockery or do anything like that. It just doesn't. And I can't imagine the U.S. showing up for any kind of exercise after that without that legal protection. I think that's a sine qua non of that relationship itself. So I agree with Jay. In this context, the ball is in Duterte's court, and Biden administration will do no harm, I think.
Great. There's a question from another FOCAP member from Jaime Flor Cruz. He would like to ask if you think it's possible that the Biden administration may revive the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was dropped by former President Trump. What will that mean for the Philippines? Do you think it will also attract the Philippines to join? If so, do you think it may require the need do you think it may require to revise the Constitution? Jay, would you like to answer that also? And after that, Mr. Thayer can proceed as well.
Well, we were not we were not on the table in the beginning of the TPP, and the constitutional restrictions were among the reasons that we could not be on that table. So I don't think that's going to change yet, no. Although there have been efforts to liberalize so many sectors of our economy in other ways, no. I think we've seen news of the House passing laws, excuse me, laws which um, even excuse me, we've seen them redefine even the definition of, say, public utilities and industries in order to get around these constitutional restrictions. But that hasn't come into being yet. So I don't think that will change. And as for returning to the TPP, well, the U.S. has a problem, I think, of credibility. Even the Biden administration will be unable to avoid that problem because they did already, Trump already pulled the U.S. out of the TPP. And so it's going to be it could be a problem for them to now turn around again and then try to walk back in, especially since the other countries who were part of that have moved on and negotiated their own deal. So I think this is something probably that they will have to reconsider, no, and think of possibly there might be other ways by which they'll pursue the original objectives of the TPP. What about you, Carl? What do you think?
I'll make a simple bottom line. The answer is no, because the Senate would block it. I'm assuming the Republicans maintain a majority. That would be clear. I think the Biden administration would look at it, and it's been a while since I've had to revisit this particular issue, but as the NAFTA agreement was redone, a lot of movement took place, but it wasn't that wholesale. And others say that when the comprehensive and progressive TPP was negotiated, there were clauses in there that would allow and could address American concerns. So it's more likely the Obama administration would do some exploring and monitoring and looking at details without fully committing the United States, or finding other ways the US could rejig its bilateral relations so that all sides benefited. I mean, there were provisions in the TPP where the US would have agricultural, I believe, benefited in particular. I don't think it's a priority. And as I can't see why a Biden administration would make it so and pursue it until we know the composition finally of the Senate, because at the moment, I don't think Mitch McConnell, he and his Republicans would be dead set against it. And also there is concern expressed in the Democratic Party about these sorts of agreements. And so reviving the American economy first, and you have to be very ginger. So it's a low profile, I think. And it would be, don't do harm. Talk about it, don't rubbish it, let it move. Negotiate individually with individual countries if you have to get some gains here or there, like the US does with Vietnam.
Okay, all right. Then I think one of the last questions will be asked by our board member and also a reporter, Cliff Benson of Nikkei. Hi, Cliff.
Hi, good afternoon. I have two questions. The first one is, under Secretary Pompeo, I think U.S. had a strong posturing. Washington clarified the scope of the Mutual Defense Treaty. They declared that the 9-dash line is illegal, and those Chinese island builders are sanctioned. Do we expect similar moves strong actions by the Biden administration. I asked that because I was thinking if there might be a risk of being perceived as, again, weak if they do probably less than that.
I think that, well, with respect to the MDT interpretation, they've already pushed the envelope um, very far. I don't think they can push it even further than that. I mean, they've already committed that any action against a Philippine ship or aircraft anywhere in the South China Sea, not just the Pacific area, but also in the South China Sea, no, will come under the terms of the MDT, no? And that's already the most you can do without then taking sides on the sovereignty issues over the islands and the adjacent territorial seas, no? They've also already made a statement officially that it considers the interpretation and application of UNCLOS to the South China Sea as laid out by the South China Sea Arbitration Award not to be the law that governs UNCLOS in the South China Sea. So there's not much more, I think, that can be taken in that regard. That's already a huge advantage on the part of the Philippines, no? So it's really up to us how we are going to now use this advantage and opportunity to protect our own interests, no? As for the other actions and activities that you mentioned, as I said earlier, no, the U.S. Interest in the South China Sea is the core of it has been fairly consistent over the years, and there have been some adjustments in response to developments. This latest development, the South China Sea Islands and China's deployment of gray zone tactics and many other things it's been doing lately. The U.S., as we've seen, has been responding to them without changing the core of their South China Sea policy. And that benefits us and the South China Sea claimant countries, the smaller ones, because really it supports a resolution of these disputes in a more equitable and legal or rules-based manner. Not something that it's against a resolution that really just values force, no, and coercion. So I think we can. I think we should be satisfied with that, no, and work on using that to our advantage to push our interests.
The bottom line, sanctions will remain in place because there's bipartisan consensus to get the bad Chinese, and that's just one way of doing it. Why change it? It's having real little impact on the Chinese companies in the Philippines and Malaysia. Both countries have said they'll still work with the parent company that's going. But my thing about the Mutual Defense Treaty is a bit of history in that the Mutual Defense Treaty was 1951, and the Philippines made claims to the Kalayaan group after that. And the U.S. position was that it couldn't guarantee the MDT didn't cover that particular area. Then the use of the word Pacific is arcane. Who in 1951 was talking about the South China Sea? It was the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, etc. So what we finally did in the Trump administration has advanced it. And as I just said earlier in this program, they're not going to resolve from it. They got a statement that, you know, metropolitan territories and islands and the armed forces of the Pacific, the Philippines in the Pacific, if they're attacked, would trigger consultations. So yes, the Kalayaan Island group is considered part of the Pacific. Those parts of the South China Sea are the Pacific. So there's an arcane tune that we would say, oh, the Pacific stops on the east coast of the Philippines is now been solved, I think. And I can't see why the Biden administration would back away from it. It makes more common ground between Washington and Manila. And that would be, by resigning from it, would, I think, you know, that would be a thing to suspend the visiting forces agreement over, because it at least if the Philippines wants to take advantage of it, then China has to be careful because it could invoke. It doesn't mean an automatic commitment, but nonetheless, it's there and it's a deterrent. But as I say, it's the same wording that Australia has. You have to build up trust between the two sides to make that alliance workable.
Thank you, Professor Jay and Professor Thayer. My second question is actually I understand that this forum is centered on the South China Sea, but U.S. is also deeply involved in Hong Kong, in the Korean Peninsula, deployments of troops in Korea and in Japan. I'd just like to know if where does the South China Sea issue stand when it comes to the Asia Pacific priorities of the U.S. under the Biden administration, and also if you can offer some thoughts on how the Biden administration will approach the issue on the Korean Peninsula also. Thank you.
Well, I think it's clear that denuclearization is the goal of the Biden administration. He would not have a summit with Kim Jong-un as Trump did unless there were prior commitments revealing and giving a stock take of nuclear weapons and an agreement to move on to that. It has to be addressed because that's an issue that affects the entire region. You say, how does it relate to the South China Sea? Well, the larger picture is the US alliances with Japan and South Korea will be less antagonistic and more responsive to each other. You're not going to have a Biden chiding the South Koreans to pay more for theater ballistic missile defense and things like that. And it will improve with Japan. And that means that they can also coordinate better in the South China Sea for exercises. And I think we'll see the South Korean Navy play a greater role, and the selling of warships and military equipment by these countries as well. It is agreed. So it's a better situation. The US and Hong Kong can only take a rhetorical position. And I spawn or encourage financial institutions to leave. I talk about setting up a Singapore, Ho Chi Minh, Bantan province triangle, bit by bit to show China they can lose from that. But it's rhetorical because, as I said before, did Trump really care? Now you want to bash China? The suppression of pro-democracy was a way of doing it. North Korea, it's in abeyance. Experts are predicting that there'll be a challenge to Biden, and we'll have to see that. But again, I'm pretty relaxed that the irritants in the Japan-South Korea relations with the U.S. will be less, and there'll be more interaction. There are differences between South Korea and Japan. That's a separate issue. But getting the U.S. to be a player with its allies rather than an antagonist at times will be the hallmark of Biden administration.
All right. Cliff, are you good with that?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay. We'll go back quickly to Jim Gomez of Associated Press, and after that, we'll have one last question. Jim?
Thank you, John. Jay and Carl. There will be an annual summit between Asean and the United States later this week at the leaders level. So I'd like to ask, how do you think both sides, ASEAN and the US, would move forward in the context of the stronger US policy on the South China Sea that was announced by Secretary Pompeo last July? How do you think both sides would move forward, considering that policy almost put the US on the side of rival claimants of China? Thank you.
I'm sure that that's the same question they will be discussing. The Southeast Asian countries definitely will be asking for reassurances about the direction and stability of U.S. policy on the South China Sea. And as Carl indicated, there's no reason why the Biden administration should pull back from that, no? Because it benefits both the U.S. and the Southeast Asian countries. But it will also be an opportunity, I think, for the Southeast Asian countries to have a more detailed discussion about exactly how they are supposed to coordinate their respective positions and policies and actions, because of course the Southeast Asians will still be concerned that well, they don't want to be entrapped, they don't want to be pulled into an unwanted conflict. I mean, those are legitimate concerns that I think the incoming Biden administration will also need to deal with and respond to. No, so that's probably going to be on the agenda. What changes to expect, and what to do about it. No.
My thing is, who is going to represent the United States? Last year, Trump didn't show. He sent a non-member of cabinet as national security advisor, and ASEAN states downgraded some of them, their representation. So it wasn't a leaders-led summit, it was a fizzer. Trump is not going to go out there. He's bailed up fighting the world inside the US to change the election results. Biden can't go. He's not president of the United States. So is it going to be Pompeo, Esper? Who the heck? And everybody knows what we had 70 days. There'll be 60 days left of the administration by the time that summit ends. And what assurances can you get? Pompeo's, and I mean, I want to put, then I'll put an adjective, the strident anti-China Communist Party crusade is dead. That's, you know, it was attacking the Communist Party, not just talking about the Chinese government. And people saw that as regime change and getting involved in that's dead. It's not going to be accepted. And we saw glimmers of that in Vietnam and in Indonesia just recently. So what assurances can they give? What ASEAN leaders would like to know, are you guys going to do a transition? Experts who've been at previous administration, there's been no contact yet by the White House. Chiefs of staff from both sides to get together to begin. The intelligence that should be flowing to the president-elect is not occurring. I mean, this is horrendous. So you're going to get a U.S. representative at that leaders-led. What can that person do? What can he possibly say that anybody can trust and take at face value? I think that's the dilemma. So 3 years of not showing up, it's going to be a relief when Biden does. And so I just leave it at that. It's a big question mark. Who the heck is going to show up from the US? What can they possibly say? And who's going to believe them?
Okay, last question will be for Carl. Well, this is a question, it's up to you to answer, but it would be good to know if you think there will be a constitutional way to unseat Trump if he continues to refuse to concede after the swearing in of Biden. Do you think there's an extra constitutional measure perhaps initiated by the U.S. Defense and Homeland Security agencies?
What's going to happen? There are 50 American states. Each one of them, their state legislatures will approve the election results. That'll occur in the state capitals. They'll pick the electors. In mid-December, they're going to go to Washington to the U.S. Congress, and they're going to cast their votes. And over 270 are going to go Biden's way. And on January 20th, he will be sworn in as president of the United States. We have to wait out that period. Nothing extra constitutional will, they could take that latest amendment to the Constitution and declare that Trump is mentally incompetent and unable to function, but I don't think they would do that. So we have to grin and bear this spectacle of America as a beacon on the hill in a democracy that has been so sullied. We have to watch this horrible play end where one player won't exit the stage. Hopefully he can be convinced. I say Kushner and his wife are doing that, but nothing extra constitution. I say the 50 states will all decide. They're Republican, Democrat, and overwhelmingly Republican that will approve those results. The electors will vote. There's only two choices. There's no third party. Should be simple. Simple majority will rule. And then the Justice of the Supreme Court will swear in the president, whether in a nice ceremony in Washington or in a secure location if there are crowds. But Joe Biden on the 20th of January and Kamala Harris will be the new leaders.
Great, thank you. Jay, would you like to?
I think it's pretty clear that if anything is going to be unconstitutional or extra constitutional, it would be one where Trump stays in office. No? I mean, the constitutional processes in the United States are being followed. No, it's Trump who's resisting them.
Mhm.
So we should expect really and hope for the dying days of the Trump administration to be I don't know, less spectacular than what they want it to be.
Okay, Jay, quickly. I know we are really gone over time here, but there's a lot of questions coming in. Last question for you, Jay. Again, I say this: do you think that the Philippines can still replicate U.S. elections in terms of voter maturity? I mean, people, have been saying basically, well, those who are not so basically on the side of the government who hopes that maybe there will be a quick change, and looking at voter maturity, will this be possible too in the Philippines? What do you think?
Can I just say no comment?
Okay, all right.
You know that
Okay,
that's a very touchy issue, and I mean,
okay.
everybody with experience in elections probably has some idea of what to expect.
Quickly, last question, Carl. This is not really about the South China Sea, but do you think there will be a change in U.S. migration policy, looking at the 500 children who still are not able to be found or traced, and also coming from migrants from developing countries? Do you think that there will be an easing up of restrictions?
Oh, Biden's already signaled that in
Okay.
various policy documents that he's going to raise the number of people that could migrate to the United States, where Trump had really reduced it. He's going to end the ban on the Muslim countries so they can apply and go through the legal processes itself. Same with meeting U.S. obligations under international law. When someone presents themselves outside their country with a well-founded fear of persecution for a whole number of reasons, they have the right to see if they are legitimate refugees under international law and be treated. Probably move heaven and earth to find the parents of the 500 or so. So yes, there will be a complete change of tone, legality, and humanity in the treatment of refugees to the United States. It's going back to that Statue of Liberty about taking your huddled masses. It's about the opportunities. My goodness, with Kamala Harris, a legal migrant, but when you add an Indian and a Jamaican and make a vice president and a woman, those are the possibilities. Migrants enrich the United States. And so, yeah, and there's a humanist streak in Joe Biden, and it will take that forward, and in the Democratic Party itself. And then I think deal with the dreamers, all that we'll see a pin going in, and it will deflate, hopefully.
Great. Gentlemen, Sir Carl, Jay, would like to thank you for your generosity and time, for sharing your expertise, and for helping us understand and report with context. We'd like to thank you for being here. And there's a lot to unpack in this forum. We've picked up on a lot of issues, and we really hope to see you in the coming months, because it's going to be a pretty exciting next few months if we look at the whole geopolitical situation. Again, thank you very much for being on FOCAP, and we look forward to having you again.